Welcome back, everybody. Today we're taking a deep dive into, World War One.
The Great War.
Yeah.
The war to end all wars.
Exactly.
We'll see how that turned out.
Yeah, but specifically, we're going to be looking at those first few years.
And 1914 to 1916.
Yeah, some really pivotal moments, and we've got a lot of different sources to work with.
Yeah, historical accounts, personal diaries, letters, poems, official documents.
And the goal, I think, for this deep dive is really to understand how this conflict that started in Europe,
This little tiny corner of the Balkans.
yeah, how it transformed into this massive global struggle, and to see, what were the consequences of that.
Yeah, what were the lasting impacts?
And I think a good place to start to really illustrate this is with a single ship,
Okay.
the SMS Goeben.
The Goeben.
So picture this. It's August 1914.
Okay.
War has just been declared like days before.
Right.
And this Goeben, which is this cutting-edge German battlecruiser,
State of the art.
yeah, it finds itself stuck in the Mediterranean,
Oh.
low on fuel.
Oh, no.
British warships are tailing it,
They're on their tail.
and it gets orders to make this mad dash for Constantinople.
Wow. So what's the significance of this? Like, why Constantinople?
Well, I think it's important to remember that at this point, the Ottoman Empire, they're technically allied with Germany,
Right.
but they're hesitant to really get directly involved in the war.
They're kind of playing both sides a little bit. They're
Yeah.
trying to figure out what's best for them.
Exactly. And so this Goeben arriving in Constantinople, it's meant to be a show of force.
A little muscle flexing.
Yeah, like a way for Germany to put pressure on the Ottomans to bring them into the conflict on their side.
Oh, so it's a bit of a gamble.
Totally.
Like, are they going to welcome this ship?
Yeah.
Or are they going to see it as a threat?
Exactly. And, well, that's the thing. There's actually a lot of resistance within the Ottoman government.
Some people are saying, hey, this is not a good idea.
But eventually, the Goeben is welcomed.
They decide to roll the dice.
And this seemingly isolated event,
It's one ship.
yeah, it ends up having this massive ripple effect.
Bringing the Ottomans into the war
Yep.
opens up new fronts in the Middle East.
Yeah, Caucasus.
It just explodes the conflict outward.
Exactly. So the Goeben is a great example of how this war that starts in Europe,
This localized conflict
yeah,
just spirals out of control.
becomes this global thing.
And as we're going to see, that has some pretty devastating consequences.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
But so while the Goeben is making this journey,
This dramatic escape,
yeah, the real focus of the world at this point is on the Western Front.
right, where the bulk of the fighting is happening.
And what's interesting is that in those early months, no one was really prepared for what this war was actually going to be like.
Yeah, it's like they were fighting the last war.
Yeah, old tactics
Sending troops charging across open fields.
against machine guns and artillery.
It was a recipe for disaster.
We have this incredible account from a French soldier named Louis Barthas.
Oh, yeah. Barthas, his diaries are so powerful.
He describes the horrors he witnessed in the trenches.
The constant bombardment,
Yeah, seeing his comrades just mowed down.
the stench of death.
Yeah, and the psychological toll.
Yeah, I mean, you can't even imagine.
Just the constant fear. And it's not just the physical danger.
Right, it's the psychological trauma
Yeah.
that these soldiers are carrying with them.
That's going to stay with them long after the war is over.
Absolutely.
And while they're dealing with all of that, the technology keeps evolving, making the fighting even deadlier.
Right.
1915, we see the introduction of chemical weapons.
The Second Battle of Ypres,
Yeah, the Germans unleash chlorine gas.
a horrifying new weapon.
Just widespread panic.
Yeah, utter chaos.
Horrific casualties.
A new level of barbarity.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just hard to fathom.
And Ypres also highlights the fact that this is a global conflict.
Right?
You have soldiers from Canada, Algeria, all across the British Empire fighting alongside their European allies.
So it's not just a European war anymore.
Not at all.
It's a world war.
And speaking of global consequences, we have to talk about the Gallipoli campaign,
Ah, yes, Churchill's grand plan.
trying to knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war.
Seize control of the Dardanelles.
It backfired spectacularly.
It was a disaster.
9 months of just brutal fighting, heavy casualties.
Man, ultimately a strategic failure for the Allies.
Yeah, and the landings at Gallipoli, especially for the ANZC troops.
From Australia and New Zealand.
It becomes this really defining moment in their national histories.
A symbol of courage and sacrifice in the face of overwhelming odds.
By 1916, the war on the Western Front has descended into this brutal stalemate.
Both sides dug in,
Yeah.
relying on these massive offensives designed to just bleed the enemy dry.
Yeah.
Which brings us to two of the most iconic and tragically costly battles of the war.
Verdun and the Somme.
Exactly.
Verdun becomes this meat grinder.
A battle of attrition.
The Germans just focusing all their might on capturing this one city.
Yeah, it's both strategically and symbolically important.
They just bombard it relentlessly,
Day and night.
trying to break the French spirit.
And yet the French, they hold firm. Under the leadership of Philippe Pétain,
The Lion of Verdun.
he understands that this is a different kind of war.
Yeah.
You can't just throw bodies at the problem.
He's focused on minimizing French casualties,
Using artillery effectively.
building up those defensive lines.
He's playing the long game.
But even with his tactics, the casualties on both sides are just staggering.
Yeah, it's just horrific.
Verdun becomes this symbol of the war's just utter brutality.
Hundreds of thousands of men dying for mere yards of ground.
It's just unimaginable.
And while Verdun is raging on, the British launched their own massive offensive,
That's all.
hoping to relieve pressure on the French.
Yeah, maybe achieve a breakthrough.
It turned into a disaster.
Yeah, the first day of the Somme is just
It's hard to even comprehend.
almost 60,000 British casualties in a single day.
It's just mind-boggling.
The Somme becomes this symbol of the futility of trench warfare.
The deadly effectiveness of machine guns,
Artillery.
barbed wire.
And yet, even in the midst of this carnage, we start to see new technologies emerging
Okay.
that hint at a possible shift in the nature of warfare.
Like what?
Well, the Somme marks the first use of tanks in battle.
Tanks.
Yeah.
Wow. That's a game changer.
It offers this glimmer of hope that maybe this stalemate can eventually be broken.
That there might be a way out of this trench warfare nightmare.
Exactly.
So we're seeing this kind of push and pull
Yeah.
between the old ways of fighting and these new technologies.
That are going to reshape the battlefield.
And it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out.
Absolutely. And that's something that we'll continue to explore in our next part of this deep dive into World War I.
Looking forward to it.
So we've been talking about just the horrors of trench warfare and the impact on the soldiers.
Right.
But it's important to remember that the war's impact went far beyond just the battlefields themselves.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. This war had this really deep psychological effect on everybody.
On everyone.
Soldiers, civilians. It really touched everyone.
And we mentioned earlier this idea of the lost generation.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just the millions of young men who died,
Right.
but it's also the psychological and emotional scars that the survivors carried with them.
The trauma, the grief, the disillusionment, it really permeated every aspect of life during those years.
It's hard to even grasp the scale of it.
And while the soldiers faced the horrors of the front lines,
Yeah,
those on the home front were dealing with their own challenges.
absolutely. Women taking on new roles,
In factories, shipyards,
families facing rationing shortages,
and that constant fear of losing loved ones.
this pervasive anxiety.
Yeah, it's a total war effort.
Everyone's fighting their own battles.
And as the war dragged on, those sacrifices started to really take their toll.
And we see this reflected in the art and literature of the time.
Absolutely. A growing sense of disillusionment, a questioning of traditional values.
It's there in that poem in Flanders Fields that you mentioned.
Yeah.
The poppies blooming amidst the crosses.
Such a stark reminder of the lives lost.
John McCrae, he was a doctor,
Yeah, he saw it all firsthand.
and his poem speaks to that profound sense of loss.
But also this determination to keep fighting in memory of those who had fallen.
Yeah, it's a powerful testament to the human spirit.
That ability to find beauty and hope, even in the darkest of times.
Yeah, absolutely. But so while the human cost of the war was just immeasurable,
Yeah.
there's another aspect that we need to explore,
What's that?
the technological innovations.
Okay.
So we talked about tanks briefly,
Yeah.
but there were other advancements that were really reshaping the battlefield.
For sure, aerial warfare, for example, was evolving so rapidly.
At the beginning, planes were mostly used for reconnaissance.
Right.
But by 1916, they're becoming more weaponized.
Absolutely.
We have accounts of dogfights over Verdun.
French and German pilots just duking it out in the sky.
It must have been terrifying.
And exhilarating.
Yeah, these early aviators pushing the boundaries of what was possible.
It was a whole new dimension of warfare.
With figures like the French ace, Jean Navarre, emerging as these symbols of aerial prowess.
And of course, you can't forget about the Red Baron.
Manfred von Richthofen.
Yeah, a legend.
But beyond the individual stories, these technological advancements,
Right.
coupled with the war's brutality,
Yeah.
they started to raise some fundamental questions.
About the very nature of conflict.
Yeah, the stalemate on the Western Front.
Right.
The staggering casualties, the use of chemical weapons.
It all contributed to this growing sense of disillusionment.
People started to question whether this war could even be won.
And at what cost?
And that war weariness ultimately played a role in the U.S. decision to enter the conflict.
Yeah, the U.S. tried to stay neutral at first.
But a number of factors pushed public opinion toward intervention.
Things like Germany's unrestricted submarine warfare,
The sinking of the Lusitania.
a British passenger liner with American citizens on board.
Yeah, that really galvanized public opinion in the U.S.
It became this rallying cry for those who argued that America couldn't just stand by and watch democracy crumble.
So the stage was set for America to enter the war.
A decision that would change everything.
As we enter 1917, the war has been dragging on for years. Millions are dead.
Hmm.
It's a pretty bleak picture.
Yeah, it really is.
But there is a major shift about to occur.
Right.
The United States is about to step onto the world stage.
And this is going to have a profound impact on the course of the war.
Yeah, the U.S. entry doesn't immediately end the war,
No, it doesn't.
but it does tip the scales.
It does in favor of the Allies.
Yeah, fresh troops, resources, industrial might.
The U.S. is a powerhouse.
Yeah, it all starts to add up.
And it gives the Allies a much-needed boost.
But even with America on their side,
Right?
the Allies are still facing a very formidable enemy.
Oh, yeah, the Germans are dug in. They're not giving up easily.
And that's where figures like Philippe Pétain come into play.
The Lion of Verdun?
Yeah, the guy who understood that this war of attrition couldn't go on forever.
He was a very cautious and strategic leader.
He favored a more defensive approach.
Absolutely. He wanted to minimize casualties and wait for the right moment to strike.
He was waiting for tanks to really make a difference, wasn't he?
He saw the potential of tanks.
Yeah, they were still a pretty new invention at this point.
They were, but Pétain believed they were the key to breaking the stalemate.
And he was also waiting for the full force of the American troops to arrive.
Exactly. He knew that eventually their numbers would be decisive.
So Pétain's patience, his understanding of both the human and the technological factors,
Yeah, that's a really important point.
it really shaped the Allied strategy.
Did he recognize that this war couldn't be won just by throwing more bodies at the problem?
It required a new way of thinking.
A new approach.
And while all of this is happening, 1917 also sees another major shift.
Okay.
Russia, racked by internal turmoil, signs a separate peace treaty with Germany.
The Bolshevik Revolution?
Yeah, it's a turning point,
It is. It allows Germany to shift troops from the Eastern Front to the West.
which intensifies the pressure on the Allies.
For sure, but even with those reinforcements, Germany is nearing exhaustion.
Yeah, years of war had taken their toll.
And with the Americans fully engaged, the tide had turned.
The momentum was with the Allies.
It was.
In 1918, the final year of the war,
Right.
it becomes this climactic showdown.
Intense, fighting major offensives.
Yeah.
And ultimately, the collapse of the Central Powers.
The German army just couldn't sustain the fight any longer.
They couldn't.
And finally, on November 11, 1918,
Armistice Day.
the guns fall silent.
An armistice is signed, and the Great War comes to an end.
It's over.
The world breathes a collective sigh of relief.
But the cost of victory was enormous.
It was millions dead, empires crumbled. The political and social landscape forever changed.
We started this deep dive with the story of a single ship.
The SMS Goeben.
Yeah, and its journey to Constantinople.
And from there, we've traced the course of a conflict that engulfed the globe
A testament to how interconnected the world had become.
and the devastating consequences of those connections.
We explored the key battles, the technological innovations
The human stories.
that shaped this pivotal moment in history.
But this is just a glimpse. We've
Yeah.
only scratched the surface.
We encourage you to continue exploring.
To keep learning.
The Great War, it causes its consequences, its enduring legacy.
It's a story that continues to resonate today.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
We'll be back soon with another fascinating episode.
Until then, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.